Welcome to the RPTM podcast, the show that breaks down the myths of monolithic history and tells our story through multiple lenses. I'm your host, Professor Ryan Lancaster. Today's episode is partially underwritten by you, the listener. Find out ways to support the podcast on my website, ryanglancaster.com. Episode 28, Missouri Compromise, Monroe Doctrine, and the tomato. Pseudohistory lacks a plausible mechanism, no way to explain it based on existing knowledge. Plausible means that things could have happened that way. It means that a given theory does not involve unlikely events and does not reverse normal development expectations. A pinecone grows into a pine tree and not a pterodactyl. An insight into how things work in the real world. Plausibility needs a denial of unbelievable actions and extreme but appropriate coincidences. It expects that results will follow causes, that a complex developments will arise from more straightforward stages. It puts the cart before the chariot. It looks for pines growing from pinecones. It frowns on theorizing social mechanisms that are not otherwise shown in that society. It discourages the assumption that people in remote ages will behave with generosity and harmony. No other age provides an example. Plausibility does not accept a divinely ordered history. It distinguishes that a belief in magic is a fact about some people in history. Still, it does not itself believe in magic. With due allowance for cultural distinction, it does not expect that people in one time or place will act out fundamentally different motives than people at other times and places. Physicists expect the order of nature to be uniform throughout nature. History has a roughly analogous expectation about individuals and societies. Historians should not use a standard of plausibility to authenticate narrow-mindedness. The American experience is probably very uncommon in world history. Both now and in the past, many people and societies have different backgrounds and operate on different social assumptions. All opinions need to be heard from, but historians should take the fake views in the context of the other ideas. Sometimes a corrupted view is more suitable to a particular situation. Historians should be alert at all levels for the proper clarification.
The Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was an effort by the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives to maintain a balance of power between the slaveholding states and free states. The slaveholding states feared that if they became outnumbered in congressional representation, they would lack the ability to protect their interests in property and trade. In 1819, the slaveholding territory of Missouri applied for admission to the Union. Northern states opposed it, feeling that southern slaveholding states held too much power already. The Constitution allowed states to count each slave as 3/5 of a person to determine population and, therefore, the number of congressional representatives the state was entitled to. This had given the South an advantage in Congress. Slavery had already been creeping into the Northwest Territory, the area between the Ohio River and the Great Lakes, even though the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 prohibited slavery. Southerners migrating into that region took their slaves with them under the guise of indentured servitude, which was legal in the area. Northerners, most of whom favored free states in which slavery was prohibited, feared slavery would become de facto in the states carved from the Northwest Territory. The admission of Missouri, which came from lands obtained through the Louisiana Purchase and lay outside the Old Northwest, added to their fears of the expansion of slavery. Representative James Tallmadge Jr. of New York offered 2 amendments to the Missouri Statehood Bill on February 13, 1819. The first prohibited any further importation of slaves into Missouri, the second required gradual emancipation for the slaves already there. The House passed his amendments along strictly regional voting lines, but the Senate, where the representation of free and slaveholding states was balanced, rejected it. Congressional debates on the issue raged for a year until the District of Maine, originally part of Massachusetts, sought statehood. Henry Clay of Kentucky, the Speaker of the House, maintained that if Maine were to be admitted, Missouri should be. From this came the notion that states be admitted in pairs, one slave and one free. Senator Jesse B. Thomas of Illinois proposed an amendment allowing slavery below the parallel 36 degrees, 30 minutes in the vast Louisiana Purchase territory, but prohibiting it above that line. Officials chose that parallel because it ran approximately along the southern border of Missouri. The Missouri Compromise, after much debate, passed the Senate on March 2, 1820, and the House on February 26, 1821. Though the compromise measure quelled the immediate divisiveness engendered by the Missouri question, it intensified the more prominent regional conflict between North and South. It served as notice to the North that Southerners not only did not intend for slavery to end, they wanted to expand its presence. In the South, the belief grew that Northerners were using slavery as a smokescreen. They could resurrect the Federalist Party and strengthen the central government at the expense of states' rights. For nearly 30 years, the compromise worked, with two states being admitted together, one slave, one free. Then, in 1850, California was recognized as a standalone free state, upsetting the balance 16-15, in exchange for a guarantee Congress would place no restrictions on slavery on the territories of Utah or New Mexico and passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, which required citizens of all states to return any runaway slaves to their masters. In 1857, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled Congress had no right to prohibit slavery in territories as part of the decision in the Dred Scott case. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 repealed the 36-30 dividing line for slavery in the Louisiana Purchase area. When President Thomas Jefferson purchased 828,000 acres of heartland from Napoleon of France for a little more than $11 million in 1803, he was delighted with the prospect of securing the vital Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans for America's interests. But with all the good that the Louisiana Purchase brought to the United States, it also presented the growing country with a painful and challenging question: should the states created out of that land be slave or free? Louisiana had been carved out and accepted as a slave state in 1812. Still, no other territory had petitioned Congress for statehood out of the Purchase lands until Missouri did so in 1818, also wanting to enter the Union as a slave state. That request threatened to unsettle the delicate balance of 11 slave and 11 free states, a balance both sides found necessary for maintaining equal representation in the Senate. The fledgling abolitionist movement saw a chance to bring its cause to the foreground. The issue of slavery in Missouri was thrown before the House of Representatives in February 1819 when James Tallmadge of New York proposed an amendment to ban slavery within the new state's boundaries. Tallmadge also advocated gradual emancipation for the thousands of chattels already living there. That amendment set off contentious debates within the House. It brought the issue of slavery into the national spotlight once again, after the topic had been comparatively quiet since the late 18th century. Southerners adamantly fought the Tallmadge Amendment, protesting the imbalance of representation that having one more accessible than a slave state would cause and the unveiled threat on the institution so critical to the plantation economy. On the other side of the aisle, most Northern representatives were not abolitionists and cared little for slaves as people but supported Tallmadge because they believed slavery posed a threat to the farm and industry economic model just beginning to take hold above the Mason-Dixon line. In short, they didn't want large plantations taking all the land from free husbandmen and their families. In mid-February 1819, the Tallmadge Amendment passed the House by a vote of 82-78, but senators defeated both the slavery ban and the emancipation proposals in the Senate. The issue remained at an impasse until December when Maine and Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House from Kentucky who owned slaves but had famously proclaimed that he was an American first and a Southerner second, entered the debate. Maine, up to that time a part of Massachusetts, wanted to join as a free state, and Clay decreed that it could not occur unless Missouri came in with slavery. In February 1820, Illinois Senator Jesse Thomas suggested a proposal that would eventually be called the Missouri Compromise. Maine would enter as a free state, Missouri would come in with slaves, but no slavery would be permitted in other states developed out of the Louisiana Purchase north of 36 degrees 30 minutes latitude, Missouri's southern boundary. The Thomas proposal was accepted in the Senate but defeated in the House, and spirited debate along sectional lines resumed Congress. Clay stepped into the fray again and used his considerable influence and power as a House Speaker to work with both his Northern and Southern colleagues and have them accept Thomas' compromise as a resolution to the situation. In early March, Congress finally agreed on what they called the Missouri Compromise. Many members of Congress remained shaken by the controversy. Slavery had once again proved to be an issue that divided the nation along sectional lines. Southerners had been thrown on the defensive to justify their peculiar institution, Northerners had fumed that slave power was trying to take up all the land. Abolitionists such as Congressman Arthur Livermore of New Hampshire wondered, how long will the desire for wealth render us blind to the sin of holding our fellow men in chains? The Missouri Compromise would prove to be only a temporary solution to the growing slavery crisis. For 25 years, the situation regarding territorial settlement remained relatively calm. But when the Mexican War in 1846 brought more land under the United States' control, the nettlesome issue flared up again. Once more, Henry Clay had to step in to hammer out a compromise, and once more, it would be only temporary, as more and more crises over slavery erupted. As the early debates over Missouri's admission raged, perhaps no one was more unsettled than the man who had purchased all that cheap land west of the Mississippi River. In 1820, Thomas Jefferson wrote to a friend that the fight over slavery in Missouri, like a fire bell in the night, awakened me and filled me with terror. Jefferson would die in 1826, but the fire bells over slavery had just begun to toll.
The tomato. To prove that a tomato is not poisonous, Colonel Robert Gibbon Johnson ate one in public in Salem, New Jersey. Tomatoes became wildly popular in various European countries like Italy in the 1500s. Spaniards brought them to their colonized countries in Asia and the Caribbean. When the fruit finally reached England much later, it was avoided since it was thought to be poisonous. John Gerard, a barber surgeon, was the first to cultivate the tomato, and he believed that it contained tomatotine, a toxic chemical. Gerard was correct, but the level of tomatotine in the fruit was too low to be harmful. His view became widespread in that people from England and its North American colonies avoided the love apple like the plague. Particularly, everyone in North America believed the rumors about the dangers of consuming tomatoes except Colonel Robert Gibbon Johnson. During the peak of the tomato season, Colonel Johnson challenged the skeptical citizens of Salem City as he announced that he would eat a tomato to prove it was not poisonous. On June 28, 1820, on the steps of the county courthouse, Colonel Johnson spoke to the crowd of 2,000 about the history of the tomatoes. He then picked one glistening red tomato and held it up for everyone to see. Colonel Johnson took a bite after bite until he finished one and picked up another. There was even a doctor on standby just in case. But the only thing that died that day was the ridiculous rumor that tomatoes were poisonous. Both Colonel Johnson and the tomato were victorious that day.
Pharmacy and women's colleges. More than anything, a series of public health crises prompted nearly 70 physicians and chemists to establish a scientific institute committed to apothecary science and safe medicines. The setting was auspicious: Philadelphia's historic Carpenter's Hall, the famed gathering spot of the First Continental Congress. The challenge to public safety was every bit as real as the events of 1774. Like most urban centers in the early 19th century transatlantic world, Philadelphia routinely suffered through outbreaks of dysentery, yellow and scarlet fevers, cholera, and other infectious diseases. So, in 1821, the College of Pharmacy and Science, now known as the University of the Sciences in Philadelphia, opened its doors. The new institute reflected the growing sophistication of Philadelphia's medical college professors, who had warned of the ignorance of apothecaries unqualified for the exercise of their profession. It also reflected a professional rivalry between the physicians and area druggists, which led to a separate college of pharmacy. Combining instruction in biology and chemistry with a progressive approach to treating illnesses, the College of Pharmacy advocated more rigorous standards and professional training for those licensed to dispense drugs, medicines, and other controlled substances. The ever-evolving, science-based curriculum reflected the growing professionalization of apothecary and medical science in diagnosing and treating illness and disease. As another sign of its continuing maturity, the College of Pharmacy became coeducational in 1876. Troy Female Seminary, an American educational institution, established in 1821 by Emma Hart Willard in Troy, New York, the country founded to provide young women with an education comparable to that of college-educated young men. At the time of the seminary's founding, women were barred from colleges. Although academies for girls existed, their curricula were limited to such female arts as conversational French and embroidery. Willard, who had opened a school of her own in Middlebury, Vermont in 1814, presented the outline for her proposed seminary to the New York legislature in her plan for improving female education. This document described a course of study that would provide girls with a broad-based and rigorous education. Financial backers favorably received her idea in some quarters, and the city of Troy raised $4,000 in taxes to begin construction of the school envisioned by Willard. The seminary's first class consisted of 90 girls from across the United States who enrolled in mathematics, science, history, foreign language, and literature. Willard herself not only served as an instructor but even wrote some of the school's textbooks. As a result, Troy Female Seminary soon gained a reputation as an outstanding institution. It proved to those skeptical that women were just as capable as men of comprehending complex subjects.
Monroe Doctrine. On December 2, 1823, in a speech before Congress, James Monroe announces the Monroe Doctrine, stating the policy that European intervention any place in the Americas is opposed and that he would establish American neutrality in future European wars. By the early 1820s, many Latin American countries had won their independence from Spain or Portugal. The U.S. government recognized the new republics of Argentina, Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Mexico in 1822. Yet both Britain and the United States worried that the powers of continental Europe would make future attempts to restore colonial regimes in the region. Russia had also inspired concerns of imperialism, with Tsar Alexander I claiming sovereignty over the territory in the Pacific Northwest and banning foreign ships from approaching the coast in 1821. Though Monroe had initially supported the idea of a joint US-British resolution against future colonization in Latin America, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams argued that joining forces with the British could limit future US opportunities for expansion and that Britain might well have imperialist ambitions of its own. He convinced Monroe to make a unilateral statement of US policy that would set an independent course for the nation and claim a new role as protector of the Western Hemisphere. During the President's customary message to Congress on December 2, 1823, Monroe expressed the basic tenets of what would later become known as the Monroe Doctrine. According to Monroe's message, drafted broadly by Adams, the Old World and the New World were fundamentally different and should be two separate spheres of influence. The United States, for its part, would not interfere in the political affairs of Europe or with existing European colonies in the Western Hemisphere. The American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintain, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for colonization by any European powers, Monroe continued. Any attempt by a European power to exert its influence in the Western Hemisphere would, from then on, be seen by the United States as a threat to its security. In declaring separate spheres of influence and a policy of non-intervention in the foreign affairs of Europe, the Monroe Doctrine drew on past statements of American diplomatic ideals, including George Washington's farewell address in 1796 and James Madison's declaration of war with Britain in 1812. When Monroe delivered his message to Congress, the United States was still a young, relatively minor player on the world stage. It did not have the military or naval power to back up its assertion of unilateral control over the Western Hemisphere, and Monroe's bold policy statement was largely ignored outside U.S. borders. In 1833, the United States did not invoke the Monroe Doctrine to oppose British occupation of the Falkland Islands. It also declined to act when Britain and France imposed a naval blockade against Argentina in 1845. But as the nation's economic and military strength grew, it began backing up Monroe's words with actions. As the Civil War drew to a close, the U.S. government supplied military and diplomatic support to Benito Juárez in Mexico, enabling his forces to overthrow the regime of Emperor Maximilian. He had been placed on the throne by the French government in 1867. From 1870 onward, as the United States emerged as a significant world power, the Monroe Doctrine would be used to justify a long series of U.S. interventions in Latin America. This was especially true after 1904 when President Theodore Roosevelt claimed the U.S. government's right to intervene to stop European creditors threatening armed intervention to collect debts in Latin American countries. But his claim went further than that. Chronic wrongdoing may in America, as elsewhere, ultimately require intervention by some civilized nation, Roosevelt announced in his annual message to Congress that year. In the Western Hemisphere, the adherence of the United States to the Monroe Doctrine may force the United States, however reluctantly, in flagrant cases of such wrongdoing or impotence, to the exercise of an international police power. Known as the Roosevelt Corollary or the Big Stick Policy, Roosevelt's expansive interpretation was soon used to justify military interventions in Central America and the Caribbean, including the Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Haiti, and Cuba. Some later policymakers tried to soften this aggressive interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine, including President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who introduced a good neighbor policy to replace the Big Stick. But though treaties signed during and after World War II reflected a policy of greater cooperation between North and South American countries, including the Organization for the American States, or OASH, the United States continued to use the Monroe Doctrine to justify its interference affairs of its southern neighbors. During the Cold War era, President John F. Kennedy invoked the Monroe Doctrine during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. He ordered a naval and air quarantine of Cuba after the Soviet Union began building missile launching sites there. In the 1980s, President Ronald Reagan used the 1823 policy principle to justify U.S. intervention in El Salvador and Nicaragua. His successor, George H.W. Bush, similarly sanctioned a U.S. invasion of Panama to oust Manuel Noriega. With the end of the Cold War and the dawn of the 21st century, the United States reduced its military involvements in Latin America while asserting a powerful influence in the affairs of the region. At the same time, socialist leaders in Latin America, such as Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela, have earned support by resisting what they view as U.S. imperialism, reflecting the complicated legacy of the Monroe Doctrine and its defining influence on U.S. foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere.
Fannie Hill. A Massachusetts court outlawed the novel Fannie Hill by John Cleland and convicted publisher Peter Holmes for printing a lewd and obscene novel. This was the first obscenity case in U.S. history. The most famous pornographic novel in English literature is John Cleland's Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure, published in 1748. It is the first-person narrative of a young woman's adventures as a prostitute after losing her virginity to a gentleman who claimed to be in love with her. The novel describes scenes of lesbianism, flagellation, group sex, and male homosexuality, emphasizing the size and appearance of the male genitalia. Some 70 years later, illustrations from later reprints of the book led to one of the earliest obscenity cases in the United States. Cleland reportedly sold the copyright to the book for 20 guineas to escape the debtor's prison. Nevertheless, Ralph Griffiths' publisher made a significant profit to launch the Monthly Review, one of the first major literary works periodicals in England. Although Memoirs was published anonymously and with a pseudonymous imprint, Cleland and Griffiths were prosecuted in Britain for obscenity in November 1749. They managed, however, to avoid punishment. In 1750 Griffiths released an expurgated edition of the book, titled The Memoirs of Fannie Hill. The novel went through frequent illicit reprints, many of which are illustrated, over the next 2 centuries. In Commonwealth v. Holmes, the court upheld the conviction of the publisher of Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure for publishing a lewd and obscene print contained in the book. According to the indictment, the publisher was guilty of being a scandalous and evil-disposed person, and contriving, devising and intending the morals as well of youth as of other good citizens of said commonwealth to debauch and corrupt and to raise and create in their minds inordinate and lustful desires. The concern for the morals of children frequently was stated explicitly in early 19th century obscenity statutes. The 1835 Massachusetts obscenity law is typical. It provided, if any person shall import, print, publish, sell or distribute any book, or any pamphlet, ballad, printed paper, or other thing, containing obscene language, or obscene prints, pictures, figures or descriptions, manifestly tending to the corruption of the morals of youth, or shall introduce into any family, school, or place of education, or shall buy, procure, receive or have in his possession, any such book, pamphlet, ballad, printed paper or other thing, either for the purpose of sale, exhibition, loan, or circulation, or with intent to introduce the same into any family, school or place of education, he shall be punished by imprisonment in the county jail, not more than 2 years, and a fine not exceeding $1,000.
John Neal and the Gymnasium. John Neal was an American writer, critic, editor, lecturer, and activist. Considered both eccentric and influential, he delivered speeches and published essays, novels, poems, and short stories between the 1810s and 1870s in the United States and Great Britain, championing American literary nationalism and regionalism in their earliest stages. Neal advanced the development of American art, fought for women's rights, advocated the end of slavery and racial prejudice, and helped establish the American gymnastics movement. The first American author to use natural diction and a pioneer of colloquialism, John Neal is the first to use the phrase "son of a bitch" in a work of fiction. He attained his most significant literary achievements between 1817 and 1835. He was the first American published in British scholarly journals, author of the first history of American literature, America's first art critic, a children's literature pioneer, and a forerunner of the American Renaissance. As one of the first men to advocate women's rights in the U.S. and the first American lecturer on the issue, for over 50 years, he supported female writers and organizers, affirmed intellectual equality between men and women, fought coverture laws against women's economic rights, and demanded suffrage, equal pay, and better education for women. He was the first American to establish a public gymnasium in the U.S. and championed athletics to regulate violent tendencies he struggled with throughout his life. Neal returned to the United States from Europe in June 1827 with plans to settle in New York City, but stopped first in his native Portland to visit his mother and sister. There he was confronted by citizens offended by his disdain of prominent citizens in the semi-autobiographical book Errata, the way he depicted New England dialect and habits in Brother Jonathan, and his criticism of American writers in Blackwood's magazine. Residents posted broadsides, engaged in verbally and physically violent exchanges with Neal in the streets, and conspired to block his admission to the bar. Neal defiantly resolved to settle in Portland instead of New York. "Verily, verily," said I, "if they take that position, here I will stay, till I am both rooted and grounded in the graveyard, if nowhere else." Neal became a proponent in the U.S. of athletics he had practiced abroad, including Friedrich Jahn's early turn in gymnastics and boxing and fencing techniques he learned in Paris, London, and Baltimore. He opened Maine's first gymnasium in 1827, making him the first American to establish a public gym in the U.S. He offered lessons in boxing and fencing in his law office. The same year he started gyms in nearby Saco and at Bowdoin College. The year before, he had published articles on German gymnastics in the American Journal of Education and urged Thomas Jefferson to include a gymnastics school at the University of Virginia. Neal's athletic pursuits modeled a new sense of maleness that favored forbearance based on strength and helped him regulate the violent tendencies he struggled with throughout his life. In 1828, Neal established the Yankee magazine with himself as editor and continued publication through 1829. He used its pages to vindicate himself to fellow Portlanders, American critique art and drama, host discourse on the nature of New Englander identity, advance his developing feminist ideas and encourage new literary voices, most of them women. Neal also edited many other periodicals between the late 1820s and the mid-1840s and was a highly sought-after contributor on various topics. Neal published 3 novels from material he produced in London and focused his new creative writing efforts on a body of short stories that represent his most significant literary achievement. Neal published an average of 1 tale per year between 1828 and 1846, helping to shape the relatively new short story genre. He began traveling as a lecturer in 1829, reaching the height of his influence in the women's rights movement in 1843 when he delivered speeches before large crowds in New York City and reached wider audiences through the press. Neal's law apprentice James Brooks captured this period of juggling literary, activist, athletic, legal, artistic, social, and business pursuits in 1833. Neal was a boxing master and fencing master too. As a printer's devil came in, crying copy, more copy, he would race with a considerable swan's quill, full gallop, over sheets of paper as with a steam pen, and off went one page, and off went another, and then a lesson in boxing, the thump of the glove to glove, then the mask, and the stamp of the sandal, and the ringing of the foils. Neal's body of literary work spans almost 60 years from the end of the War of 1812 to a decade following the Civil War. However, he achieved his significant academic accomplishments between 1817 and 1835. His writing both reflects and challenges shifting American ways of life over those years. He started his career as an American reading public, beginning to emerge, working immediately and consistently within the nation's developing complex web of print culture. Throughout his adult life, especially in the 1830s, Neal was a prolific contributor to newspapers and magazines, writing essays on a wide variety of topics including but not limited to art criticism, literary criticism, phrenology, women's rights, early German gymnastics, and slavery. His efforts to subvert the British academic elite's influence and develop rival American literature were credited mainly to his successors until more recent 21st century scholarship shifted that credit to Neal. His short stories are his highest literary achievement and are ranked with Nathaniel Hawthorne, Edgar Allan Poe, Herman Melville, and Rudyard Kipling. John Neal is often considered an influential American literary figure with no masterpiece of his own. Neal protested disfranchisement of free black Americans by revealing how freeborn Americans, because of their color, not just in the slave states, but in the states where slavery is regarded with horror, are suffered even to vote, being either excluded by law or excluded by fear. Wary of practical racism among white Northerners, Neal drew attention to members of his Gymnasium who in 1828 voted that no colored man can be permitted to exercise with white citizens of our free and equal community. Hurrah for New England! We have no prejudices here, none but wholesome prejudices, at any rate. Disappointed they would not admit the black men he sponsored for membership, Neal ended his involvement with the gym shortly after that. In fiction, Neal explored the differences between Northern and Southern prejudices against black Americans, particularly in the Downeasters. He nevertheless believed in phrenological inferiority, explaining that while we disregard color, we pay great attention to form, in our estimation of capacity. The Negro head is very bad. This led him to a proto-eugenicist argument for legalizing interracial marriage so that future generations of the Negroes of America would no longer be a separate, inferior class, without political power, without privilege, and without a share in the great Commonwealth.
Noah Webster. Noah Webster Jr. was an American lexicographer, textbook pioneer, English language spelling reformer, political writer, editor, and author. He has been called the father of American scholarship and education. His blue-backed speller books taught 5 generations of American children how to spell and read. Webster's name has become synonymous with dictionary in the United States, especially the modern Merriam-Webster dictionary published in 1828, as an American dictionary of the English language. Born in West Hartford, Connecticut, Webster graduated from Yale College in 1778. He passed the bar examination after studying law under Oliver Ellsworth and others but could not find work as a lawyer. He found some financial success by opening a private school and writing a series of educational books, including the Blue-Backed Speller. A strong supporter of the American Revolution and the ratification of the United States Constitution, Webster later criticized American society for needing an intellectual foundation. He believed that American nationalism was superior to Europe because American values were superior. In 1793, Alexander Hamilton recruited Webster to move to New York City and become an editor for a Federalist Party newspaper. He became a prolific author, publishing newspaper articles, political essays, and textbooks. He returned to Connecticut in 1798, and served in the Connecticut House of Representatives. Webster founded the Connecticut Society for the Abolition of Slavery in 1791, but later became somewhat disillusioned with the abolitionist movement. In 1806, Webster published his first dictionary, a compendious dictionary of the English language. He began his second attempt the following year. In total, it took 28 years to complete. To evaluate the etymology of words, Webster learned 26 languages, including Old English, Greek, Hebrew, and Latin. Webster completed his dictionary during his year abroad in 1825 in Paris, France, and Cambridge. His book contains 70,000 words, of which 12,000 had never appeared in a published dictionary before. Webster believed that English spelling rules were unnecessarily complex as a spelling reformer. Hence, his dictionary introduced American English spellings, replacing color with a U to color without, substituting wagon with one G for wagon with two, and printing center ER instead of center with RE. He also added American words, like skunk and squash, that did not appear in British dictionaries. At the age of 70, Webster published his dictionary in 1828, registering the copyright on April 14. Webster did all this to standardize the American language. Though it now has an honored place in the history of American English, Webster's first dictionary only sold 2,500 copies. He was forced to mortgage his home to develop a second edition, and his life from then on was plagued with debt. In 1840, the second edition was published in 2 volumes. On May 28, 1843, a few days after he had completed revising an appendix to the second edition, Noah Webster died. Noah Webster was a Christian and famously said, "Education is useless without the Bible." His dictionary contains 70,000 words and over 6,000 Bible references and remains one of the only mainstream dictionaries to use Bible references to demonstrate the meaning of words. His dictionary is an essential tool for anyone studying the Bible. Christian readers will find it rewarding to compare his definitions of such words as marriage, education, sin, law, faith, prayer, etc., with those given in any modern dictionary. They will undoubtedly be surprised at the significant differences and may come away with a renewed respect for American. He was also influential in establishing the Copyright Act of 1831, the first major statutory revision of U.S. copyright law. When Noah Webster published the original Webster's American Dictionary of the English Language, he included several LGBT terms in his book. Webster, however, focused on terms for gay sexual practices and ignored lesbian sexual practices, bugger, buggery, sodomy, and sodomite. He occasionally cited the King James Version. For example, Webster noted First Epistle to the Corinthians vi to define the homosexual context of the term abuser. Another citation is the Book of Genesis 18 to associates the term cry to Sodom and Gomorrah.
You've been listening to the RPTM podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate us on whatever platform you're listening on. Join us again next week when we talk about the seen and unseen of U.S. history. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, for more information, check out the show notes on my website. The show was produced by me. Our editor is me. Written and researched by me. Music is Down South by Bliv Beats. I'm Ryan Lancaster, and this was the RPTM podcast.